these lectures are lectures that were devised for Slade graduate painting students. So this particular one was from 2015. And it was actually Estelle Thompson, who's the current head of graduate painting, who asked me to do this lecture. She had read an article by Jonathan Watkins on Crivelli that he wrote in the late 80s. And Carlo Crivelli is one of those artists who many people don't actually know about. And I certainly hadn't really kind of registered him as an artist until Estelle pointed him out to me. And so Crivelli was an artist I was familiar with only through really just one painting. And I'd like to ask my technical assistant to show you that painting. So this is the Annunciation, painted in 1486. And I had a postcard of this painting on my wall as a teenager after visiting the National Gallery, where this work is. But as I began to research the lecture on Crivelli for the Slade, I was surprised to find that actually the National Gallery had an entire room of Crivelli's paintings. So I began to observe Crivelli's other works, and this small painting of St. Catherine from around 1491 to 4, measuring only 38 by 19 centimeters, blew my mind a little bit. Here we see St. Catherine, who appears gracefully within a niche, referencing the display of sculpture. She rests one hand on the wheel upon which she was tortured, and in the other hand, she pinches a palm, a symbol of her martyrdom. Crivelli also includes a fly, but this fly belongs to a system of scale outside the one that depicts St. Catherine, which must indicate that the fly belongs to another reality or another world. The fly is life-sized. Its scale is in relation to our own, and not the scale present within the rest of the painting. Its parallel position to the picture plane also suggests it resides on top of the painting and not within the depicted space. Is this in fact an object that exists in Crivelli's world as he is making the work, referencing those moments of process? Or is the painting of St. Catherine and a fly, or a painting of St. Catherine with a fly on it? The artist Andy Pankhurst once told me that the best examples of conceptual painting are to be found in the National Gallery's collection. So why had I only just discovered the revelatory pictorial clout of Crivelli? I was intrigued as to why I had overlooked so many of his works. It seemed I had been continually redirected to the surrounding pieces that exist in the sphere of Renaissance painting, such as Raphael's St. Catherine from 1507, also in the National Gallery's collection, where much seduces the eye through saturated color, soft features, classical contrapposto pose, and tangible emotion. Crivelli sits awkwardly, and some might say unattractively, within a period of painting that was celebrated for its re-education in classical thought, technique, and aesthetics. Renaissance painting combined perceived emotion with a greater understanding of the depiction of space, enabling the viewer imaginative entry into a painting. This is Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in Ecstasy from 1475 to 18 in the Frick's collection. Alberti's highly influential Treatise of Painting, published in 1435, instructed that paintings should be seen as an open window through which we look or enter, as we willingly suspend our disbelief. However, Crivelli does not make such efforts to conceal his design in order to enable imaginative entry. His works retain the cool, linear line of late Gothic painting. If you look past the subject and into Crivelli's design, you begin to notice certain tests that are conducted within his paintings for the purpose of exploring the limits of illusion, something Renaissance artists are so committed to keeping intact. Crivelli, it seems, is much more interested in pursuing highly contemporary ideas about the nature of painting. Like a magician who reveals the mechanics behind their trick, Crivelli's Fly begins to point out the flaws in a pictorial system that viewers have begun to accept and imagine is real. It is Crivelli's exposure of illusion through the use of illusion that makes him the most conceptual painter of the Renaissance. In order to fully understand Crivelli's place within the development of painted three-dimensional space, it is important to explore a little of what went before. I should also say here, apologies if some of these slides are a little pixelated. By the early 14th century, Giotto had sparked a new occupation for painting, or rather returned art on the path towards illusion. He and others began to depict holy figures in a more natural way compared to earlier works. This is Giotto's Madonna and Child seen on the right from 1320, and an unknown Byzantine painter, and the Madonna and Child from 1290. Giotto achieved this through the softer moulding of features, the depiction of greater tenderness, and the more believable representation of fabric that followed more closely the contours of the body. Though many works were yet to reside within a believable space. This is Giotto's Peruzzi altarpiece from 1310 to 15. The background of much painting was covered in gold leaf in order to reflect light for the purpose of producing a divine glow. However, gold leaf was soon combined with figures who reside within architectural space, seen here in Duccio's Annunciation from 1310. Like a child's pop-up book, the simple Romanesque architecture appears to fold away from the green leaf so it can house the figures of Gabriel and the Virgin. The depicted architecture deepens the picture plane and allows the figures to be contained within tangible space. Duccio also employs the structure to frame the figures and enhance the narrative as Gabriel moves through an arch as Mary leans back into her porch. There are beautiful portrayals of geometry through the pointed and curved arches and right-angled edge of the far right column, cut out to reveal the passageway from which Mary has emerged. Its rich brown hue is the same tone as her deep blue robe, which regains its edge when in contrast to the warm pastel wall of the exterior. From the mid-14th century onwards, artists continued to house their saints within increasingly believable architectural structures. Ambrogio Lorenzetti's presentation of the Circumcision of Christ from 1342 sees us witness Christ being pointed out as the Redeemer, and unlike most portrayals, Christ displays the attributes of an infant as he sucks on his finger. You can just see that. The Gothic architecture supplies the entire spatial context for the scene and refers to the time it was painted. Although it does not yet correctly use linear perspective, it is successful in closing the gap between past and present, making this ancient scene seem more immediate to its contemporary audience through its use of familiar architectural design. The interplay between figure and architecturally determined perspective was to become a hallmark of Renaissance painting, and was widely being attempted, if not yet mastered, across Europe from the early 15th century onwards. However, by the 1420s, a system for depicting space had been developed by architect Brunelleschi and expertly executed in paint by the young Masaccio in Florence. Masaccio's Holy Trinity, painted in 1427-28 on the walls of the Santa Maria Novella, is considered one of the most important contributions to the Renaissance. The figures have presence and gravity. They stand and move in a credible, coherent, and continuous pictorial space, constructed and according to the rules of linear perspective. The vanishing point exists at the foot of the cross, in the middle of the first step, upon which we see the donors, above them, the Virgin and St. John, and finally the Holy Trinity itself, God the Father, the Holy Spirit, which looks like a kind of white collar around God's neck, and finally Christ, who, when compared to previous medieval painting, is incredibly convincing. His arms are taut and his abdomen hollow, as his body is in conflict with the gravity that attempts to pull him away from the cross to which he is nailed. At the very bottom, a skeleton lies upon a tomb that seemingly sits upon the floor of the church, included to remind us of our mortality. The inscription reads, "What you are, I was. What I am, you will become." This is one of the earliest examples of painting that combines emotional intensity with scientific discovery, whilst also referencing antiquity, presence in the iconic and Corinthian column pilasters, triumphal arch, and coffered vaulting ceiling. Masaccio has managed to open up the wall and absorb the space of the church into the picture. Distinctions between the real space of the spectator and the imagined space of the picture are minimized. The conceived space moves both toward and away from the viewer. To a contemporary audience in the 15th century, the effect must have been astonishing, if not startling. As the Tate Modern opened its doors in 2000, Nicola Sirota, its then director, explained that the new realistic space created by the young Masaccio in the third decade of the 15th century was just as challenging to Florentine conventions of depiction as was Picasso's development of Cubism in the first decade of the 20th century. Masaccio died after the Holy Trinity was painted, probably from the plague and tragically before he reached his 30th birthday. Although many European artists were still to achieve the necessary understanding in order to depict three-dimensional space as effectively as Masaccio, many did begin to also successfully describe their subject in an expressively humanist way, and also began to push the limits of the frame. Oh, sorry, one moment. I think there is a slight mute problem. Thank you, Maestro. In Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, which you can see here from 1435 and in the collection of the Prado, Christ is carefully lifted down from the cross as Mary faints, pale with grief. She mimics his pose, which is intended to mimic a crossbow in reference to the Great Guild of Crossbowmen who commissioned the painting. The figures are somewhat crammed within the shallow space of the picture frame, which seems to house a grassy floor which meets a gold-leafed wall. The event is contained within the brackets of the two outer figures, which emphasize the limits of the frame. The emotion is tangible. The woman in the back left attempts to prevent the tears from leaving her eyes as they roll down her face and into the corners of her mouth, the taste of her tears upon our lips. Van der Weyden portrays a powerful depiction of grief that was admired by many Italian painters. Elsewhere in the north, Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, who many of you may now be more familiar with, was creating the Ghent altarpiece, completed in the 1430s. He propels this allegorical display towards the contemporary world through nature, which is depicted with an attention to detail not seen before in Northern European art. The lower panels contain recognizable species of plant, and the landscape in the distance contains representations of existing churches, bridging the gap between the celestial and earthly worlds. Van Eyck refuses to idealize the fallen figures of Adam and Eve, seen at either end of the altarpiece. They display human attributes that distinguish them from the divine. This is clearly after the fall, as Adam, like Eve, attempts to conceal his body as he takes a step out of his cramped confines. Van Eyck is playing with the illusion of space, encouraging us to believe that Adam can leave the three-dimensional space in which he is depicted. The inclusion of steps within painting began to signal the threshold between painted space and the viewer's space. The viewer is suddenly made aware that things may not remain within the frame. The frame itself was no longer a passive, but an active device that could be crossed. Artists began to compose images in collaboration with framing devices, often creating their own painted borders to ensure full control over what surrounded the image. In Veneziano's A Miracle of St. Zenobius from around 1442 to 8, we can observe a narrow pink painted frame. which infers we are looking through a window while stood to the left, judging by the shadow on the right-hand side of the frame. Such a device supports Alberti's idea that painting should be a window through which we look. The rapid inclusion of steps and sills within much painting provides strong visual evidence that artists were interested in the idea that paintings can be imaginatively entered and occupied. If we take Antonello de Messina, St. Jerome in his study from 1475, the steps and archway measure the distance between viewer and space. The outer entrance moves towards the spectator's space. Its magnification is set up in contrast to the extreme diminution of space, illustrated through the landscape glimpsed through the back windows, revealing a life beyond the confines of the room. The empty floor facilitates a sensation of expansive space and the extraordinary description of near and far. We see the tiled floor in sharp focus at the front of the painting, and accept that if we were to walk towards the back of the room, the floor which fades to light would look the same as the floor we see at the front. However, the effect of the arch seems to send out a contradictory message. We are encouraged to believe we can enter this space, yet are purposefully denied access through the arrangement of the partridge, peacock, and the grass bowl on the first step. We also have restricted emotional access to the subject. This seems to be a depiction of space and not personality. The saint appears to be reading, his eyes downcast, his body stiff and lacking in any emotional attributes. The absence of a ceiling and two walls means he appears to reside in the middle of a vault. The spiritual nature of Jerome's thought is perhaps expressed through the architecture. The beautiful soft light that spills into the back of the space, the objects of study that litter his shelves and desk, and his shoes abandoned at the bottom of the steps, illustrate the transition from active to contemplative life. Architecture also dominates the composition in Piero della Francesca's The Flagellation of Christ from 1455 to 60. An incredibly violent episode in the life of Christ is depicted behind, as three men rather unconvincingly whip Christ, who is bound to a classical column. In the foreground, three other figures dressed in contemporary clothes are seemingly in conversation, oblivious to the gruesome event unfolding behind. The driving force of this work is the architecture, expertly and accurately configured using single-point perspective. The presence of the figures does not deliver any clear emotional message. Their inclusion only appears to facilitate or validate the artist's depiction of architecture. By the mid to late 15th century, many artists had the necessary tools and knowledge in order to depict spaces through which we could imaginatively enter. This development of illusion created a different type of interior that gave the spectator an impression of being within or on the threshold of indoor space. Careful structuring of the entrance threshold made it possible to suggest a world beyond the painted image. Viewers could be diverted from the world of the subject depicted to a more immediate reality. Carlo Crivelli is an artist who does just that. His works begin to question the limits of illusion and starts to test the parameters of painting. One of Crivelli's most famous works, The Annunciation, was painted in 1486. It was commissioned by the town of Ascoli to celebrate their freedom from papal rule and granted right to self-govern in 1482. The news reached the town on the 25th of March, the feast day of the Annunciation. Here we see the angel Gabriel arriving to inform the Virgin she will bear the Son of God. Alongside him is Saint Emedius, the patron saint of Ascoli, who holds a model of the town. Like many artists of the Renaissance, Crivelli demonstrates his understanding of one-point perspective for the purpose of rendering three-dimensional space. Like others, he has housed his holy figures in a contemporary domestic environment, which also celebrates the rebirth of classical art, evident in the Corinthian plasters and triumphal arch. However, rather than attempt to conceal his design for three-dimensional space, the composition is sucked backwards towards the grid on the far wall, seen through the arch. The only line to cross the diagonals that race towards the vanishing point is the Holy Spirit's line of light, which highlights the event we are witnessing. Artists such as Botticelli also used entirely structured design. evident in the Adoration of the Kings from 1470 to 5. The image is composed around a great cross within a circle, although Botticelli works hard to avoid an overwhelming symmetry by shifting the vanishing point away from the center of the circle. He also dismantles some of the most regular features of the architecture into ancient ruins, which also creates space. The figures are scattered about the foreground to further disguise the central cross. Crivelli's figures zigzag towards the vanishing point and appear rather stiff and in tableau. The colour palette adds to the painting's artificiality. Take away the blue sky, and you are left with a pronounced terracotta surface, which produces a stifled warmth that lacks much air or atmosphere, a common feature of Crivelli's work as a result of his beautifully synthetic colour choice. The sense of conscious design, as opposed to the careful observation of nature, is continued in the consistent graphic mark of Crivelli's brush, which ensures all forms are clearly defined. Hardly anything disappears into soft shadow, unlike the work of Renaissance painter Leonardo da Vinci, who tempts us to believe what we are witnessing is real through his careful observation of how light hits the surface. Crivelli keeps the lights on. Everything is available to the eye in crisp, clear focus. His methods of depiction clearly indicate that this is an invented rather than an imitated reality, conceived from the combination of the literal and fantastic, which when combined produce a strange and compelling quality one might describe as a hyper-reality. Painters are able to improve on the achievements of architecture in the same way that today, CGI enables us to experience a world we cannot yet construct and could previously have only imagined. Crivelli is able to reveal the Virgin to the viewer in her private chambers, without having to follow the practical construction applied to other buildings in the picture. She is encased within the building, surrounded on three sides, her hands delicately crossed, echoing the wings of the dove, her privacy emphasized by the barred window. Only ourselves and the Holy Spirit achieve access, we being the more privileged as we take pleasure marveling at the Virgin in her private setting, whilst the Holy Spirit enters through a hole in the wall. The angel and saint may catch a glimpse through the window grate, but to physically reach her, they would need to step down into our world and enter through the door. The composition is so focused on this barrier between the three main figures that the work almost becomes a painting of a corner. But the beautifully elaborate details, such as the carpet, the peacock, the birdcage, the plant pot, and the symbolic contents of the Virgin's chamber, ensure enough takes the eye away from the street corner. Crivelli is not interested in conducting paint into a format that evokes drama or emotion in the way Da Vinci might. His intentions are more cerebral. A gourd and an apple protrude from the step towards our space. Advancing from the frame of the painting, the two fruits placed over the inscription blur the divisions between the sacred scene envisioned in the painting and the temporal space inhabited by the viewer. The fruits also emphasize the step as the gourd continues into the space beyond the surface it sits. The trompe-l'oeil effect of these fruits is strangely at odds with the artificial nature of the rest of the picture. It's as though Crivelli is making a distinction between the depicted scene, which is clearly unreal, and the fruits, which are real. Even though we are fully aware the whole thing is artifice, Crivelli has seemingly managed to depict two levels of reality that exist within one image. However, before we get further into this idea, it may be helpful to reflect upon Crivelli's training and the possible origin of his ideas. Although much biographical information is scarce, it can be presumed that Crivelli studied under Francesco Squarcioni in Padua, which between 1440 and 1460 was one of the most brilliant artistic centres in Italy. This is Squarcioni's Virgin and Child from 1460, and his ideas and influence are clearly in evidence within the works of his pupils, such as Schiavone, his Madonna and Child with Angels from 1459 to 60, and Marco Zoppo, This is his Virgin and Child with Angels from 1455. These works include some of the elements of Crivelli's paintings we are already familiar with: an illusionistic step, graphic linear modelling of the figures in the manner of late Gothic art, and the inclusion of fruit, seen here in Crivelli's Virgin and Child in the Viennese collection from 1480. Crivelli also employs elaborate fabrics as backdrops in order to frame the figures within the overall composition, also seen here in the Madonna of the Swallow from 1490 in the National Gallery's collection. Such devices also avoid the problem of depicting a regressing three-dimensional space, a problem Crivelli only ever extensively tackles in the Annunciation. Squarcione's most famous pupil was Andrea Mantegna, who left the studio in his late teens, and this is his St. Euphemia from 1454. Placed like a statue in a niche, this work also points to the influence of another, Donatello. The celebrated Florentine sculptor was in Padua between 1443 and 1454. During this time, Donatello was working on the bronze altar of the Basilica San Antonio, which consisted of 4 panels that describes passages from the life of Saint Anthony. This is the miracle of the ass and the miracle of the avaricious man's heart. It is impossible to say for sure how influential Donatello was on Crivelli, if at all, but it can be readily observed that the graphic nature of his brush often contains the form within a fine black line, which mimics the incised mark of Donatello. Much of Crivelli's painting also considers the three-dimensional qualities that by definition sculpture possesses. As previously discussed, he encourages objects like the golden apple to leave the frame, just as Donatello allows the toes of his cupids to grip over the edge of the frame, seen here in Dead Christ with 2 angels. This being a composition Crivelli may also have based his own painting of the same subject upon, this being Dead Christ supported by 2 angels from 1470 to 5. In his ambition to collaborate sculpture and painting, Crivelli goes as far to include stucco relief in his Demidov altarpiece from 1476, also in the National Gallery, seen here in the keys held by the figure of St. Peter. The decision to include three-dimensional objects on the surface of a painting at first seems rather naive. When combined with painting, such an addition merely emphasizes the two-dimensional nature of painting. It diminishes any possible illusion and fails to make the painting any more real. The presence of three-dimensional objects amplifies the impossibility of physical three-dimensional space within the now clearly two-dimensional surface. But perhaps this was Crivelli's intention, to highlight the illusionistic failings of painting, which, as a medium, can never compete in the presence of physical three-dimensional forms when in pursuit of portraying three-dimensional objects. Sculpture and architecture undoubtedly had a huge influence on painting throughout the Renaissance. Painters began to endow their subjects with the qualities of sculpture by housing them upon steps or within niches, or within architectural settings of their own that the subjects sometimes showed signs of vacating. Painters also began to blur the divisions between the depicted and actual architecture, seen here in Mantegna's San Zeno altarpiece from 1457 in Verona. The painting is divided into 3 sections by a frame consisted from 4 Corinthian columns, which again record the classical past. The space behind the columns unifies into one scene that continues across the whole image, united by the hanging garlands. The pairing of real columns with further classical ones behind begins to distort the pictorial boundary. The garlands of fruit are sandwiched between the 2 columns on the edge of our space and the pictorial space. These attempts to push back away from the picture plane and into the wall, as first witnessed in the work of Masaccio, was also expertly attempted and achieved by Mantegna's brother-in-law, Giovanni Bellini, in his San Giobbe altarpiece from 1487. The subtlety of light portrayed through the soft moulding of paint on panel reveals highly naturalistic renderings of cloth and figure with reference to the achievements of Da Vinci. Here we see a collection of biblical figures under a Masaccio-esque coffered ceiling and golden mosaic niche, which seemingly shimmers with light which has travelled into the space from an exterior source. St. Francis to the left welcomes us in with his hand outstretched. Now removed from its original context and currently housed in the Accademia in Venice, the full illusion of space is diminished as the painting is denied its intended collaboration with surrounding architecture. But this can be observed in Bellini's later masterpiece, the San Zaccaria altarpiece from 1505. Just as Masaccio's Holy Trinity, we can see how the artist is now able to dissolve the assumed properties of the wall. Just like his brother-in-law Mantegna, Bellini mimics the existing architecture of the church, extending it from the space of the church into the space of the painting. The viewer is encouraged to imagine these holy figures reside in the same building and therefore same space as themselves. This sensation is further enhanced by the direction of light that spills into the painting. Bellini's work is positioned and designed to appear as though it contains the light from the open door of the church in which it resides, further breaking down the barriers between depicted and real. Painting again mimics the environment and atmosphere in which the viewer exists, helping us suspend our disbelief. The interplay between figures and architecturally determined perspective became a hallmark of Renaissance painting. This is Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican from 1509. Almost as if it were its own aesthetic category, figures began to appear within believable spaces that the viewer understood in relation to the physics of the world they inhabited. Painters were able to create and keep their depicted illusions intact as they successfully concealed the two-dimensional properties of painting for the purpose of creating a convincing perceptual reality. However, Crivelli seems intent on revealing any illusion he may have achieved as artifice, which in turn captures a much greater reality, albeit a more conceptual one. Whereas in the Demidov altarpiece, it is the raised relief that emphasizes the painted two-dimensional space, here it is the fly that willingly illustrates the artifice of painting. But one wonders if his contemporary audience were ever aware of the visual tests Crivelli conducted. His small painting of St. Catherine is a predella and would have been one of a series of small paintings that completed the bottom tier of a multi-panelled altarpiece, unlikely to have been seen up close by a contemporary audience, which perhaps ensured that from a distance, many did presume that the fly was real. The inclusion of flies within painting has a rich history. When discussing the presence of flies in Crivelli's work, art historian Norman Land references an anecdote originally published by Vasari when writing about Giotto. Vasari explains that when the artist was a young man, he entered Master Cimabue's shop and painted on the nose of a figure, which Cimabue had just finished, a fly so natural looking that the master, on his return, tried more than once to brush the fly off, believing it was real before he realized his error. Such an anecdote surely points to Giotto's skill and also perhaps his sense of humor. It also highlights the potential of illusion within painting. Renaissance architectural theorist Ferretti explains that sculpture will always appear to be the color of its material. A figure carved in marble will have the color and texture of marble, whereas figures and objects in painting are described in applied color, a medium that when mastered can accurately replicate anything seen by the eye. Crivelli also includes a fly in his Madonna and Child from 1480 in the collection of the Met. However, this time the fly is not quite parallel to the picture plane, and instead is more incorporated into the depicted scene. The fly seems to have caught the attention of the Christ child just before his eyes flick to the right, as depicted, his head still fixed towards the fly. If Christ had indeed been looking at the fly, it would signal to us that they belong to the same depicted world, and not separate ones, as in the case with St. Catherine and the fly. This painting again possesses much we already recognise within Crivelli's work: the hanging apples and gourd to represent the poisonous fruit of the Garden of Eden, responsible for original sin, and the antidote, the gourd, a symbol of the resurrection. These are suspended by a deep red lace, which must be tied to a support concealed from view by the limits of the frame, if we are able to believe that these fruits are actually hanging. The fruits cast deep shadows onto the newly unfolded cloth that bears its crisp creases that add to the geometry of the painting. This also conceals much of the backdrop, sidestepping the problem of describing recessive space. The diminution of figures and trees suffice. The hands, as within all the hands of Crivelli's figures, are deeply engaged and have hold of other forms within the painting. The Virgin's index finger is gripped at the fold of Christ's forearm and elbow as he tightly holds onto a goldfinch, pressed against his chest, a bird believed to protect against plagues, and like the gourd, is an antidote to evil. The presence of evil perhaps illustrated through the fly, Beelzebub in Hebrew, meaning Lord of the Flies. Another popular feature of Renaissance painting was the cartellino, a piece of paper bearing the artist's name that creates the trompe-l'oeil effect of a written text or material that is attached to the surface of the painting on its completion, seen here bearing Giovanni Bellini's name in his Doge Leonardo Loredan from 1501 to 2 in the National Gallery's collection. Christ's glance directs us towards Crivelli's cartellino, which contains the words opus, which infers the image is the result of his work and skill, his research, if you like. The inclusion of the cartellino is aimed at establishing an illusion, while simultaneously confirming the author of its artifice. But this particular cartellino goes further than depicting illusion. It alludes to a time frame outside the one represented in the picture. Crivelli has previously depicted a cartellino held in place with small blobs of wax in the Madonna of the Swallow, seen here. But this time, he has decided to expose the lack of permanence the properties of the wax possess. The bottom right-hand corner is missing its blob. Sometime in the recent past of the picture, it has dropped off, leaving a faint red stain of existence. Crivelli is again asking the viewer to consider a range of realities that move in different directions. We are invited to engage with the religious symbols and figures through sensation as we soak up the beautiful colour, the tender touch of the Virgin, and the stunning description of texture. We must also not overlook the fact that Christ's comfort has been carefully considered. The beautiful yellow cloth covers the cold stone shelf upon which a plump pink pillow sits. It accommodates the weight of Christ, which moulds the cushion into a form that produces a nipple-like shadow. Yet these perceptually perceived constructs are presented alongside a more knowing construction of image. Just as in the small painting of St. Catherine, we are presented with another level of reality. The presence of the fly existing within its own context of scale alludes to an illusion on top of an illusion. And here, we have an action that points to a previous state of existence when all four blobs were intact, and also to a future when more blobs may disappear, perhaps resulting in the complete disappearance of the artist's signature. We might also wonder if this time frame occurs in relation to the scene depicted, or to the time frame within the artist, when the artist constructed the work. Is the cartellino on the cloth or on the surface of the painting? These layers of perceived reality are also present and perhaps even more strange and complicated in Crivelli's Ecstasy of the Blessed Gabriel Ferretti from the late 1480s, also in the National Gallery's collection. This strange painting does little to draw you in. If anything, it deters the eye. The boggle-eyed St. Gabriel gazes up at a vision of the Virgin and Child, garishly framed by red and gold angels. The landscape to the left, behind Gabriel, reminds me of cooked salmon and parsley. Its flesh tones are bright green foliage, which makes way for a cave that impossibly contains water. It's quite hard to see from this, but you can just see it to the extreme left of the panel. The vulva-like shape the opening of the cave creates is echoed in the praying hands of Gabriel and the vision he beholds. A path snakes away into the distance, scattered with figures toward distant mountains behind. Stones are also distributed across the dry ground, some organized in suggestively phallic combinations of shape. These could be chance configurations of shape, but 4 times is a bit more than a coincidence. We are all evolved to recognize phalluses. Surely Crivelli knew exactly what he was doing when he arranged his pebbles. Artists do not paint unthinkingly. Combinations of shape are their currency, which the best use to great effect. You may think I have taken these observations too far, but I know that if I had accidentally painted 4 phalluses, to leave them would be a very conscious decision, and I am no doubt that Crivelli saw them just as we see them. So perhaps he was a bit of a pervert, especially if we do read the cave hand and vision as vulva-like in shape. Or perhaps he was a bit of a daredevil, seeing how far he could push the limits of decency and outright blasphemy right under the nose of the church. The physics of depicted space are also warped. Buildings are depicted using perspective, yet the scale of objects is wholly inaccurate. If St. Gabriel were to stand, he would tower above the buildings. The tree stumps on the right seem very close to him, yet portray the scale of distance. The tree included on the left behind Gabriel appears to have grown into the shape of a cross, signalling the future of Christ. A bird, possibly a goldfinch, sits upon a branch directly above Gabriel, bizarrely with its back to us. The head, perhaps of another Franciscan, floats to the right of St. Gabriel's left elbow and does not have any convincing relationship to the space in which presumably his body resides. 2 ducks are crammed into a pond at the bottom left-hand corner below Gabriel's large bent-back toe. Here we are able to observe Crivelli's technique. His fine graphic marks accentuate the edges of form, sometimes appearing as fine hair. Delicate lines work in units to accentuate the folds of the fabric and the shadows on the feet and sandals. Crivelli again incorporates his signature, seen in the bottom right. This time it appears in perspective, as if etched into the dirt on the ground. As is the standard function of artist's signature, it identifies the painting as his own, and himself as the author of this fictional scene. However, if we accept that the signature is written in the dirt, then who wrote the words in the soil with such precision? There are no likely candidates located in the painting, so the artist must be present as the creator of the work, and also imaginatively present in the past of this fictional landscape. Just as a 4th blob of wax was once present within the frame of the Madonna and Child, so was the artist once present within the landscape of St. Gabriel in order to write his name. Such questions may stray too far from the realms of the painting, but to arrive at them at all must indicate Crivelli's intention to highlight the artist as innovator, not imitator, a sophisticated mechanic of design that calls into question the potential of paint on a 2-dimensional surface. Crivelli's experimental investigation into the contained painted image is perhaps most explicit in his use of shadow. The garlands of fruit, which bear little relationship to the rest of the image, cast shadows on the sky. It is difficult to not let this downgrade the rest of the painting to deflated illusion. This is no longer sky, but a representation of sky. If there ever was an illusion of sky, it is one we can no longer take seriously because it has been upstaged or exposed by the additional shadow, which makes the fruits impossibly close to the sky. The shadows cast by the fruit entrust them with a greater pictorial authority, whilst the sky is demoted to surface. As stated by Jonathan Watkins, Crivelli undermines the painted illusion in order to assert the materiality of the art object on which they occur. However, we are still to mention perhaps the strangest part of this painting, the vision of the Virgin and Child. Gabriel's vision seems to hover in the viewer's space. This sense of projection is created both by the placement of the figure at a slight angle toward the picture plane, and also by Gabriel's gaze, which travels upward and beyond the confines of the painting. Another addition that supports this sensation is a shadow that falls upon the building to the far right above the trees, which seems to be a shadow of the vision itself. We witness the vision at the same time as Gabriel, yet with so many oddities to contend with, this sensation is not clearly conveyed. I also remembered earlier that when I looked at this painting in the summer with some students, they noticed that actually Gabriel's not really looking at the vision. He's actually looking at the bird perched above him. So, I mean, who really knows what's going on? Crivelli continually plays artifice and illusion off against one another. Environments are created which are clearly a construct. conveyed through his unusual palette and encased in the graphic nature of his mark. Crivelli's hand is so different from the typical Renaissance brush that delicately melts and molds tone across harmonies of colour in order to accurately describe light in the manner of Leonardo, Bellini, and Raphael. In comparison, Crivelli's visual language is rather harsh and tight-lipped. Its linear graphic quality, elongated fingers, and raised relief seem old-fashioned and outdated. Yet his confidence seemingly remains intact, never knocked by the rising stars of artists such as Bellini, whose works possess the seductive, elegant flow of much celebrated Renaissance composition. Crivelli continues to paint cool, rigid arrangements that celebrate the hallmarks of their design. Rather than conceal their method of creation by appearing somewhat miraculous in their conception, Crivelli's work possesses an awareness and honesty that clearly states that what we encounter is the product of the artist's making. Crivelli exploits his position as author and the control it delivers him. He conducts continual tests that prod at the limits of painting. Artists such as Bellini, seen here, strive to keep a unified illusion intact in order to diminish the materiality of the art object on which it occurs, thus preserving the integrity of the picture plane. Masaccio created a fourth wall within painting, a wall which the viewer looks through or stands just in front of, encased within the space created by the artist. The fourth wall is a theatrical term that refers to the audience's position as a viewer facing one way, looking through a missing fourth wall at a rectangle of light within which the action takes place. Within theatre, the fourth wall is broken down when the actors directly address the audience. And in film, when actors talk directly to camera, acknowledging our presence as viewer. In a similar way, Crivelli breaks down the fourth wall. He recognizes our presence by letting us in on what occurs behind the scenes of painting. Crivelli disrupts and exposes the deceit of illusion by including multiple illusions within one work, which reveal each other as artifice, thus highlighting the material properties of the art object. Crivelli insists we remember that painting is a construct capable of deception. He does not dissolve the properties of the panel through the use of accurately recorded light or perspective like his contemporaries. Crivelli refers us back to the picture plane, which he manipulates through ideas rather than illusionistic effects. He reminds us of art's ability to deceive. We become fully conscious that we are looking at a two-dimensional surface. Crivelli's work is eternally relevant. It reminds artists of their status as image makers, pictorial puppeteers, orchestrating and trialing various solutions before settling on a visual outcome worth pursuing. He reminds us all works are made through concept and process. They are a construct, a manipulation of reality, made not through some miracle of production, but by an artist who enjoyed messing with us. The progressive conceptual clout of Crivelli's painting is somewhat concealed by the archaic, Gothic visual language he deploys. In some sense, it is a shame his paintings are at risk of disguising their ingenuity through their use of a coarse aesthetic the eye is likely to pass over. But on the other hand, this means they are gems waiting to be discovered. The fly, the missing blob of wax, and the shadows on the sky begin to allude to the questions posed by the artist in the 20th century. In his 1988 paper on Crivelli, Jonathan Watkins uses the example of Magritte and his work, The Treachery of Images, from 1928 to 9, when finding conceptual common ground. Magritte rightfully informs or reminds us that this is not a pipe. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. And indeed, it is not. It is colour upon a surface. But then it is a pipe. So do we believe the authority of the image or the authority of the text? Crivelli shows us a fly to remind us we are looking at a representation and not a reality, but it is the representation of the fly that undoes the reality. And Magritte tells us we are not looking at a pipe by painting a pipe. When artists represent various realities within one scheme, a struggle for authority ensues, and we as viewers like to insist on knowing which is the authoritative reality. The truth is, there is not one, and that is just how artists like it. A world of possibilities that prompts endless questions which will forever engage the mind and fuel the hand. Although painting 500 years apart, Crivelli and Magritte trigger contradictions within single works that expose the deception of images and image making. Michael Craig Martin's 1973 work, This is an Oak Tree, continues the conceptual seminar. It consists of a glass of water placed upon a shelf with an accompanying text displayed on the wall below, which explains how the artist has transformed a glass of water into an oak tree in the form of an interview. I'll read an extract from it. Question: haven't you simply called this glass of water an oak tree? Absolutely not. It is not a glass of water anymore. I have changed its actual substance. It would no longer be accurate to call it a glass of water. One would call it anything one wished, but that would not alter the fact that this is an oak tree. Isn't this just a case of the emperor's new clothes? No. With the emperor's new clothes, people claim to see something that was not there because they felt they should. I would be very surprised if anyone told me they saw an oak tree. Was it difficult to effect the change? No effort at all, but it took me years of work before I realized I could do it. This is an oak tree illustrates the authority of the artist, and like Crivelli, Michael Craig Martin shows us how the artist is capable of allowing the viewer to see things that are not there. We do not engage with the object presented, we instead seek answers to the questions it poses, answers that will not be found within the image or art object presented, but relate to a wider world beyond the confines of any space or frame. Mediocre artists show us only the contents of the frame or art object. Great artists lift us outside of the frame and away from the artwork. They show us things we cannot see.